And with that, over to Bhavya. Yes.
Hi, guys. My name is Bhavya. I'm a rising sophomore at Harker in San Jose, California. I'm very passionate about improv, singing, theater, art, and rowing. I love rowing. At Mahatma, I have just launched my first app, Improv World, which hopes to democratize improv across the globe. We have partnered with schools across rural India to launch improv periods that will help boost creativity.
Great. Thanks, Bhavya.
Nidish, you're on mute. I don't know if you like, yes.
Yeah, I just realized, sorry. Hi, my name is Nidish. I'm in the 11th grade and I study at Stonehill International School at Bangalore. And I care deeply about mental health, medicine, public health, and just building ways to like help people become better versions of themselves. And at Mahatma, I have launched 2 apps so far. CTIER, which is a mental health app. It's a mental health awareness platform for younger like students across India, and a basketball app that uses AI to look at your posture and teach you basketball.
It sounds very good. That sounds, I love the concept. Well, the first one sounds really valuable and the second one sounds really intriguing.
Yeah.
I could benefit from the improved posture. I'm not sure I could benefit from the basketball, but anyway.
Okay, so we are so excited to welcome Dr. Naushad Forbes to our talk today. Naushad Forbes is one of India's most prolific industrialists. His latest book, The Struggle and the Promise, Restoring India's Potential, has received rave reviews from everyone, including India's former Prime Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh, Singapore's former Prime Minister, Goh Chok Tong, Ratan Tata, and Raghuram Rajan. Dr. Forbes is the chairman of Forbes Marshall, one of the world's leading manufacturing companies. He is also the chairman of Ananta Aspen Center and Center for Technology, Innovation, and Economic Research.
Thanks.
Dr. Forbes received his bachelor's, master's, and a PhD degree and PhD degrees from Stanford University, where he also taught for 20 years. He has written widely on innovation in developing countries and higher education in India, including a book, From Followers to Leaders. And it was co-authored with David Wield. He writes a monthly column for Business Standard, and he's on the board of several educational institutions and public companies. And Dr. Forbes has long been an active member of the Confederation of Indian Industry, CII, and was the president of CII for 2016-17.
Okay, and with that, let's get started with the first question.
Sure.
So, excuse me. Okay. Uday Kotak once said that India has always been a challenging picture but an exhilarating movie. At any point, it seems like everything is going wrong. But over 10 years, we have seen large positive trends towards moving people out of poverty, wealth creation, public infrastructure development, and etc. I think that my favorite thing about your book is the framework with which you look at India. As you describe in the book, this combination of simultaneous struggle and promise is so evident in India. As young people in the audience, how do you think we should look at India holistically? How do we remain optimistic as we commit to working on building a better country?
So, great question, Bhavya, and that's indeed what I believe. I believe that India has to be seen as a long-term play, that if you look at it exactly as you said, if you look at it at any point in time, it seems like an incredibly noisy, even disruptive place. Like say at the very present, our headlines are full of these MLAs from Bombay who were first shipped to Surat, supposedly a BJP state, and therefore they could be kept there. Then that was considered too close to Maharashtra, so they shipped them to Guwahati. I mean, this kind of stuff. is what we see in our headlines every day. And if we judge India on that basis, no one would ever invest in it. We would never do anything in it. Fortunately, that's not what India is about. India, in the longer run, is a much more steadily improving place. It's not a smooth road, but the road, I think, broadly has tilted upwards, certainly for the last 30 years. Again, it's not unidirectional. You will have things that happen that set us back, things that we do that seem really perverse. But at the end of the day, you have to look at the place holistically. And if you look at the place holistically and look at the place with a longer time orientation, I think that leaves one much more positive. Let me give you one example of that, and then I'll stop. In the last few years, one of the things that people have pointed out is sort of the challenge to institutions and to the independence of institutions. This is taken the form of, for example, maybe the misuse of institutions to target political opponents. It's not as if the BJP government has been the first to use this. This is something that Indira Gandhi pretty well perfected some years ago. But the BJP has been doing this in a very extensive way to target political opponents using the various institutions of state. And it seemed for a period of time that the Supreme Court, for example, was not taking up the right cases. It was deferring important questions and spending its time on things that were quite trivial and were not necessarily the priorities that it should be addressing. Suddenly something changed. About a year and a half back, a new Chief Justice came in. That Chief Justice seems to have been much more independent. And we see the Supreme Court playing its role as an independent institution and as an autonomous institution and as a check on government power. Now, what led to that institutional renewal? You can't say. It may just have simply been the right person getting into the right job at the right time. But at the end of the day, we have a renewed institution. And so I take great hope from those kinds of incidents, that even when I'm most depressed about what's happening in some part of the country, there's something else that's going on that gives me encouragement and hope.
That's a good answer. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask you about us. I just want to ask you a question about the Agnipath scheme.
So you're fading in and out, but what I caught was you'd like to ask me about the Agnipath scheme.
Yes. 1 second. Nitish, yeah, I think something's off with your internet. Do you want to quickly get it checked?
Might have it's fascinating. It's fascinating to see.
Nitish, try switching your video off maybe for a bit and see if that helps.
Yeah.
Sometimes it does.
Yeah.
I
don't know if you can hear us. 1 second.
Maybe he'll rejoin. Then
Yes.
it'll be better.
Bhavya, do you want to, we do have Nitish's question on text. Bhavya, do you want to read out the question, please?
Yeah, I can read it out.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so I wanted to ask you a question. Well, Nitish wanted to ask you a question about the Agnipath scheme that the government of India recently launched. While the scheme may have its merits, it's fascinating to see the anger it has generated. It seems clear to me that young people in India are deeply dissatisfied with the employment opportunities they are being offered. Unemployment remains one of India's biggest challenges. Research shows that India needs to create 20 million jobs per year. That's 10 times more than what India is doing right now. In your book, you describe several ways we can tackle this problem, from tourism and large-scale manufacturing to skilling and labor reform. My personal favorite point you made, My personal favorite point you made, though, talks about how high-quality jobs can raise productivity and help develop people, making them modern, quoting Stanford sociologist Alex
Inclus. Yeah.
Inglis here. Do you think that the Agnipath scheme could potentially help develop millions of people and make them more modern? What else can we do to dramatically accelerate the pace of development of our people?
So, I mean, one of the things that's striking is that the quality of your questions is way ahead of most of the interviews I've done with our press. So a great question. Nidish, that was your question, huh? Right?
Yeah, I think it was.
Okay, great. Okay, fine. So great question. Here's my take on the Agnipath scheme, and I think you're exactly right about the connection with modernization and modernity and the role it could play in that. So my reading of the scheme, this is not something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about or reading about. I was traveling much of the time when it was, hitting our headlines all the time. But my sense from reading the scheme is that it makes sense. It's a good scheme. It's a good scheme because it gives people this 4-year program where they become part of the armed forces for a period of time. And that can do exactly what Alex Inclus talked about in terms of exposing people to a certain modern way of behaving and a modern way of living, and it can become then a mass scheme, because if it's for 4 years, it means that so many more people can go through that kind of a program. Now, having said that, why the great anger and response that we've seen? I don't think it's, I'm sure that people, the opposition has taken, political advantage of it and so on. But I think the anger is real, and the anger reflects exactly what you said. The anger reflects this concern over jobs, and this deep concern over jobs. And one of the things that, made government jobs so attractive is their permanence. That's you sort of said, if I get this job, this government job, I'm secure. I'm secure for decades. And that's being taken away by the Agnipath scheme. And that, I think, is what has prompted this anger. Now, how could this be handled? First of all, I think it should have been presented as a supplemental scheme instead of as an alternative scheme. Second, the style in which this government does things, and I have the farm laws is a good example of that, actually. I think damages the prospects of some of these sensible reforms, because when you simply announce things, you capture the imagination of the country and the attention of the country, and that's the style in which this government likes to operate. But that's not necessarily the way in which you make things happen in an effective way. Instead of that, let these schemes get discussed. Let the opposition fall all over these schemes and attack them, debate them in parliament. Let that go on for a few weeks, because two things might happen. One, you might actually improve the scheme. You may, as a result of the debate, actually end up doing something better. But what you will certainly end up doing is that you're giving people voice, you're giving people the opportunity to be heard. And if they have opportunity to be heard, then maybe they won't take their protest out onto the street because they think they've been able to express their voice, express their concerns. The concerns don't necessarily have to be accepted and things changed as a result, but at least you're respecting people by listening to them and hearing them out. There's a different way of doing things. And I think our democracy kind of demands that more consultative, listening, progressive piece, instead of, okay, we have a majority, we can do what we wish, let's go ahead and do it. Yeah. I think that's what then gets us into trouble. And then sensible schemes like the farm laws, like the Agnipath scheme, end up getting into trouble. Yeah, you know what we have now is that we have this, that the government's trying to coordinate a campaign in support of the Agnipath scheme. So, industrialists are getting calls saying, speak out in favor of the scheme, take out ads in favor of the scheme, all of this stuff. I mean, listen, put all that time and effort before the scheme gets announced, not as a way of putting the fire out after the fire starts.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. So we're gonna move on to the third question. So I especially loved the last two chapters of your book, chapter 10 on culture and chapter 11 on politics. I agree wholeheartedly with everything you said, but you seem to be making a link between building an inclusive society and accelerating economic growth. I would like to believe that this is true, but countries like Israel and China, which are not inclusive in any way, have shown high levels of economic growth. Countless boycott campaigns have been unable to stop foreign industrialists from investing in these countries. The current Indian government seems to be betting on this as well. As long as they can show economic growth, foreign industrialists would continue to invest in India, irrespective of the worsening communal tensions. How do we convince governments that building truly inclusive societies where no one is discriminated against because of their religion, their race, gender, sexuality, etc., is the best thing to do economically and not just morally?
You're sticking to your record of wonderful questions. I do believe that very, very, very strongly. And I wrote after the book was about to come out, actually in December, January, I wrote 2 articles in the Business Standard specifically on the connection between inclusive political institutions and inclusive economic institutions, and sort of took that argument a bit further. And I took it further as an India-China comparison. We'll talk about Israel too, since you mentioned it. But this was specifically, the articles were comparing India and China. And it started by saying that the articles were titled "A Window of Opportunity." And they were called, the reason I titled it "A Window of Opportunity" is because I made the argument that China, with its non-inclusive political institutions, was starting to damage its economy and its economic prospects. So after decades of incredible economic progress, incredible economic progress of a scale that the world has never seen before, in terms of the number of the hundreds of millions of people who were lifted not only out of poverty, but were lifted into a kind of middle class existence in China. And after all of that, because of one man, and one man who thinks he has all the answers in the Chinese premier, you now have, an attack on private industry. You have tech, which is under great pressure. You have private equity that's starting to look elsewhere for alternative investment opportunities. You have this completely crazy approach to COVID, where the zero COVID approach that's continued way beyond any logical analysis. And the economy is starting to suffer as a result. Travel is way down. The disruption in supply chains is causing firms worldwide to look at alternatives to China. And private investment is starting to look at alternative places to do business. So you have everything in a sense going wrong. And I was saying that this is an opportunity for India now to catch up. And then the argument that I made in the second article, everyone, by the way, loved the first article, and they said, yeah, India's chance. second article was why we have a chance. And I made the argument, which I am taking a bit further what I say in the book, that the period in time when we had our most rapid economic growth, sort of 1991 through to, if you like, 2014, really 2012, things slowed down in 2012, but those 20 years were actually a period when we had coalition governments, and we saw the very substantial rise of regional parties in different parts of the country. So these two phenomenons led, it seems to me, to institutions becoming much more autonomous. And they became much more autonomous simply because you didn't have a dominant political party that could control things. Now, given that you had these more autonomous institutions, and I was not making any argument that these new political parties that started were wonderfully nationalist and totally committed. Many of them were thoroughly venal. But the net effect of this power getting dispersed was that you saw the rise, you saw not the rise, but you saw the independence of institutions being enhanced. And that independence of institutions led, it seems to me, to more sensible economic policy making, and led then to more inclusive economics as well. And I think it's no accident that we then saw the most rapid growth in our history at the same period of time. Now, how do you go about doing that? You know, if you have a really wise, strong government, can you get there even better? Maybe you can. But the argument I'm making is that, listen, we shouldn't expect the completely unreasonable. We should expect the reasonable, which is, and the reasonable is that we should say, listen, let's have reasonably independent, autonomous institutions. And how do you get that? Either because you've got a wise government in power, or because you've got power that's fragmented. It doesn't matter, as long as you end up with these independent institutions, you net end up with a more inclusive economic structure. Yeah. So that's sort of the view that I've taken. It's not a very elegant or clean, if you like, argument. It reflects the noisy and messy democracy that we are, but I think that is more consistent with how we've progressed as a country. Now, your example of Israel is very interesting. See, Israel is an example of a country where it's actually been economically very successful in recent years, but it's been, exactly as you say, very successful for those who are Israeli citizens, not for the Arab populations. The Palestinian population of Israel, which is quite significant, do not have citizenship, do not have rights, are not included in this progress that Israel as a country has actually experienced. And so they're sort of left out of the picture of progress in the country. So you're quite right to point out that Israel is actually an example of non-inclusive growth, certainly when it comes to the Palestinian population. To the Jewish population, it's a different matter.
Thank you.
Nidish, you want to go next?
Yeah, I'll go next. So as mentioned in the first few pages of the book, do you think that India is unique in terms of its struggle being mainly in the part of how the policies implemented, rather than necessarily the kind of policies that are like being put in place? And if so, do you think that there's something at the root of India or its culture that has led to this struggle in the implementation of policy?
So we're not unique, but there are other countries that I think would benefit from a similar approach. And my my best example of that is that the book was read by an Indonesian. Well, he used to be the Indonesian trade minister, and when he read the book, his comment, he sent me an email saying, "I thought you were writing about Indonesia." And I wasn't, I mean, and then a friend of mine who is in Mexico wrote and said the same thing. So, I thought you were writing about Mexico. So there are other places. So Latin America, countries like Indonesia, which are very diverse again, have a similar kind of, I think they would benefit also from a state that tried to do less, because of their diversity, tried to do less, and because of the same two problems. They have diversity and they have limited state capacity. And when you put those two things together, the argument that I make is that because if you put those two things together, then the state should choose to do less. It should do a few things well, the things that only it can do and must do, and leave the rest to relatively simple, straightforward solutions. So take my example. I don't have this example in the book. My example is everything just now on climate change. That if you say, how do we get to a much lower carbon future as a country? I think we should design our approach with this limited state capacity pattern that we have. So what I would recommend is a straight carbon tax, because the advantage of a carbon tax is that it's relatively simple. It's one thing that you have to do. Once you've done it, at most you need to raise those taxes over the years. And it then is a relatively simple that you don't need much state capacity to administer it and implement it well. But if you start wanting to achieve that low carbon future by, changes in transport policy, changes in, what kind of fuel should be used where, changes in where things can be done, then you're starting to place a much greater demand on state capacity, which we've not demonstrated our ability to actually deploy. So that's the approach. That's what I recommend. Yeah. Now, if you look at other countries, which are the countries that have those same elements? There are many countries that have great diversity. Many countries that have low state capacity. And wherever you have those things coming together is, I think, where a similar kind of approach applies. Now, are there some purely Indian things that apply culturally? Yes, there are. They apply more extremely here. So our diversity is really diverse. I mean, I think we're the world's most diverse country, not only because of our size, but because of our huge pluralism. I mean, we look different parts of the country. We speak the number of languages that we do. We have 200 million, a Muslim population of 200 million. All of this is incredibly makes us so diverse. And actually, this thing about I think it relates to the earlier question too, that if we have a population where we have a 200 million strong Muslim population, and if we say, well, we won't bother about them, we leave them behind. Hey, listen, what would make, let's go on the basis that we all share the same ambition that our current government has of making the country a great, rapidly growing, strong player in the world. Are we going to be a stronger country and get there faster if we carry 200 million people along with us, or if we try to isolate them? It seems to me the answer is pretty clear.
Yeah.
Okay, so this question is actually about your writing process, because it was interesting to see how you nicely mapped out what you're going to write where, because like in the chapter 1, you mentioned what you're going to write in chapter 10 or like chapter 9, which I found quite fascinating. So I was wondering, what is your writing process like?
Oh, it's so the thing about a book is that it looks more logical than the actual process necessarily was. So it was an iterative process. So I did write chapter 1 first, and I did try to lay out my argument because I wanted to sort of say, here's where I was going with the book, right? So I did do that. But when I did that, I think the first time I wrote chapter 1, there were 9 chapters in the book. As the book came along, I ended up with 11 chapters, right? And then I went back and redid chapter 1 so that the chapter 1 as an introduction to the book matched the book that I'd actually then written. So it was an iterative process. But I find it very useful to start, especially in nonfiction, to start by saying what you're going to say, because it's a way of, at least for me, it's a way of organizing my head and sort of saying, here's what I'm going to say, and then you try to draw connections one with the other. I'll give you an example of some feedback that I got. One of the points that someone raised, you mentioned that you really liked chapter 10 and 11, on culture and politics. And one of the points that I got feedback on was, look, you should put chapters 9, 10, and 11 first, up front in the book, because they're really fun and good, and that will get everyone to read the rest of the book. Now, and I said, that makes sense, but that's going to be just too much work now after I've sent the book to the publisher, you'd have to sort of basically start by rewriting it, and I'd probably get some referencing wrong and, end up with something in the book that was sort of just kind of hanging there, and, that was in chapter 2 and was actually introduced then in chapter 6 because of my flipping things around. And I said, this is too big a change. I won't make that change. But it's an iterative process, and I recommend. But I'll make 2 comments. I recommend that it is a good idea to sort of say, here's what I'm going to say, because that's a way of organizing things. And the second thing that I recommend is just start writing. If you wait for perfect inspiration, you'll never write anything.
Yeah, I'm gonna get started on a novel today.
Yeah,
that's it.
So now a novel can be a bit different. But my favorite author, P.G. Wodehouse, that there are many quotes in the book, right? P.G. Wodehouse had an interesting writing style, apparently, for his novels. What he would do is that he would have, he used to type, at that time, he used to type on an old Royal typewriter himself. And then he would type a page at a time, and he would paste his pages. Each chapter would go around the room, right? Each page, one after the other. And then he would rewrite pages. And when he rewrote pages, he would retype the whole page. And then have, the 2 alternatives. And the one that he liked more was on top, and the ones that he liked less would be further down the wall. And then when he figured he was done, he would just walk around the room and take the top page off the wall. And that was his chapter, because he kept working on it. I mean, it's an interesting writing style, a really interesting writing style, especially for fiction, because he works so hard to polish each sentence and so on. But each person has a different writing style that works for them. And I remember when I read this description of P.G. Wodehouse, I just thought it was a really interesting, different writing style. And he would work in a very disciplined way. He would sit down and type from, for 2 or 3 hours in the morning and 2 or 3 hours in the afternoon. And he did this every day of his life until he was 93. So.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. All right.
Okay, so just yesterday, the United States Supreme Court overturned the Roe versus Wade, allowing the US government to dictate women's reproductive rights and curb their freedom to make their own choice. And of course, in India, such laws have also been passed that attack people's rights to privacy and freedom. And in chapter 2 on economic policy, you say that for India to lead, we need to govern less, not more. And you add that a good government would seek to do fewer things, but to do those things better. So how do we get the government to willingly give up power and thus the control they exert on individuals?
So, if you look at Roe versus Wade, I mean, it was the Supreme Court ruling was indeed, when it first happened, it was a landmark ruling because it in a sense, it went over the rights of individual states to restrict women's rights to have abortions. Yeah. And what the Supreme Court has now done is that they basically said that each state has the power to, do what they wish, in a sense, with some limits, but to do what they wish. And it's a backward step, right? It's okay, it depends on your perspective and so on, yeah. But in my head, it's a backward step. Yeah, it's now, how do you get the right forward movement? I think you kind of have to rely. You have to rely at different points in time on individuals who simply, this is going to sound terribly paternalistic because it is paternalism that I'm advocating. You simply rely on people who know better. So in that sense, when Roe versus Wade first happened, the progress at that time was relying on the Supreme Court deciding to do something, which it said, this is the direction we should go in as a country. And so they decided in a progressive way, even though it rode over the rights of individual states to do what they wished. Yeah, I think you have to rely on those sort of I know better impulses at different times that take one forward. We saw this with, I think, Nehru especially, frequently, doing many things where it was simply, look, this is what's good for India, and so I will do it, even though there wasn't that kind of institutional backing or belief that said that those kinds of policies were the right things at that time. And it helped establish democracy in the country. His respect for democratic institutions. I credit him with the fact that we're a democracy, simply because what's my argument? Well, my argument is, look at our neighbors in Pakistan, right? Same source, same institutionals that we inherited. At the same time, we've been a democracy. Pakistan has been a democracy for less than half of its existence as an independent country. What was different? What was different was that the first prime minister that we had respected those democratic institutions and invested them with a lot of credibility. And those first 10, 15 years was so vital in establishing that pattern of respect for institutions. It's an argument in favor of some people knowing better. Now, we need that from time to time. We need that to move us along. We need an Angela Merkel to say, we can do this, to accept immigration from Syria and so on. You need those kinds of things that run against popular wishes in countries. And that's what statesmanship, it seems to me, is all about. But we shouldn't expect it all the time, because if you expect it all the time, one, you probably won't get it. You'll probably get, authoritarian rule instead. And second, if you do get it, you probably get it doing more than one probably should. You want this from time to time to move things along, but otherwise, I think a less intrusive state is sort of what I would want to see in place, certainly for us. That was a somewhat muddled answer, sorry.
Okay, thanks.
Now for question 7. In your chapter on culture, you say that India is the most diverse country in the world. In fact, you rank countries on a homogeneity to a heterogeneity scale, going from South Korea to Japan, to Taiwan, to China, to USA, to Mexico, to Brazil, and finally to India. I found this to be fascinating. How do we maintain the pluralism that makes India great while striving for greater economic outcomes for all of our citizens?
So, I do believe very strongly that we are the most diverse country in the world, and for all the reasons that we've spoken about in terms of language and community and everything else. Yeah, and that given this huge diversity, and given the combination, as I mentioned earlier, of low state capacity, I think then one should expect the role of the state is not to direct what needs to be done in the economy, but to enable private companies and private individuals and NGOs to address and move things forward. So the role of the state then is to enable as opposed to direct and decide. And I think we've demonstrated that when that's what the state does, private companies really do respond in a very powerful, effective way. We've seen this in the last 30 years. We've seen this with NGOs. The number of NGOs that have flowered in these last 30 years is incredible. A great example here, right? And some of these roles, if we were Norway or Sweden, we wouldn't have a role, right? Because you have a very effective state, high capacity, all of that stuff. You don't need someone who's going to take Nidesh's example. You don't need someone who's going to worry about mental health because the state's worrying about it for you. You don't need private NGOs to really address these things. But we're India, so we do. And I think we should design policy on that basis, where you have a much more limited role and you create space for everyone to operate and do their own thing. So how do we have a really thriving economy? So, I give a couple of examples, and like say tariff reform. If you take tariff reform, the thing that lower tariffs does is it forces all firms equally to compete. And if you are forced to compete, then you become more efficient, etc. Now, something like the production-linked incentive scheme is, well, it involves the state making choices. It involves a bureaucrat saying, these are the items that are important for us to have in the country. I worry about that because we've not demonstrated our ability either to pick the right items, but even more, the danger is that some of those are then open to capture later or open to crony capitalism, where you have a firm and the government that gets together and says, okay, now, protect me and, I'll give you a nice donation, before the next election or something like that. And those are things that we must, I think, protect against. So we should be much more, it seems to me, much less discretionary in our policies as a way of actually leading to better economic outcomes. I mean, we saw this, from 1991 to 2017, the state kept, maybe not perfectly, but it kept withdrawing from the economy, and the economy responded very attractively.
Okay, thank you.
How important do you think challenging one's belief is in general, and what purpose do you think that like exposing yourself to different views, like what purpose do you think that serves?
So first of all, I think it's very important because if you, I mean, certainly I can say for myself that, in our company, if we went with what I first thought we should do, we would have ended up with grossly inferior outcomes to what we ended up doing. Yeah, and I would and there were some things that people felt, no, he feels very, very strongly about this, so we won't question it. And if I ever got a sense that that was the way it was, then I would consciously encourage discussion on it and questioning on it and so on. Because, was it really a sensible thing to do, even if I felt strongly about it? So, and I think it's a way in which you end up with better outcomes. If you're challenged, you might end up doing exactly what you originally wanted to do. But as a result of being challenged, you will end up believing it even more strongly because you're more convinced that it's the right thing to do. And in the process of that discussion, others start to believe also it's the right thing to do. So it's not just, look, we'll do this because he's saying so. We'll do this because, yeah, we think it's the right thing to do. So even if you don't change from where you started, it's still useful to have that challenge and discussion.
Right. And do you think that in order to challenge one's belief, we need to have platforms of discussions of topics with that have both great controversy and those that are generally accepted? Do you think it's important for us to still go over and challenge one's beliefs, even if they're controversial topics, and have platforms to do so?
I think very much so. I think one of the things that we need to learn to do as a society is to have reasoned discussions about controversial things. So, take, for example, affirmative action, right? There are some things that we see as being, off limits, that you can't have a discussion on this. Maybe there are some things that you really, that are so sensitive that, you worry about them, et cetera, et cetera. So but I think then you must set up the discussion in such a non-combative way, where you go out of your way to get people to be very reasonable, to use the right language, to listen to each other. It's possible to do. It's possible to do. And I think the more we can do it, even with very sensitive topics, the healthier it will be. Take affirmative action. We've had affirmative action programs for decades now, right? What's the result been? We should really look at what the result has been. Has it delivered as it should? And that's not to challenge the basis of affirmative action. It's to challenge the program and to say that, is there a better way of getting these same objectives met? Would a more targeted intervention work? Would a broader intervention work? What would be the right way of approaching this? And trying to get more of discussion around more sensitive topics, I think, is a very healthy thing. And I think the kind of conversation we're having now is wonderful. And if you have it, with each other, this is the way in which we can build the right kind of approach to discussion and, dealing with things that are tough and sensitive, and we should.
Lastly, we see that just from the outside looking in, it seems like the number of riots and fights that take place over political topics in India are much more severe, or they take place more frequently than in the countries, say the US or something like that. It just seems like that from the outside looking in. And do you think that a lot of this can be neglected, and a lot of this can be solved by just having these platforms to just talk it out between the two sides?
Well, I don't know. The US is not a model when it comes to reasoned discussion at present, unfortunately. It's the exact opposite. No, it's such a polarized society. In fact, I would go to the extent of saying that it's a society that has, I wouldn't necessarily use the word that it's a society that's broken, but it's a society that's deeply cracked. And it suffers from just this problem that people do not have a reasoned discussion. I'll give you an example of how it could be done in the US, from the US. I had friends, I write about them in one of the chapters, Harry and Beverly Rowan. I remember going to that place one evening for dinner, and they had these in the community, in the local county election. The local county election was coming up, and there were these various things that were coming up for people to vote on. And they had 2 copies of these, of all the resolutions that were coming up to be voted on. And things had been highlighted and circled and so on. And apparently they would do this with every election, county election, state election, national election. And they would look at all of these things that were up for voting on. Each of them would go through and make their own notes. And then the 2 of them would get together one day after dinner and they'd discuss each point. And then they would still vote the way they wanted, but they would discuss each point. And I thought to myself, if every individual who voted applied the same kind of thought and preparation to everything that we voted on, this is the way democracy should be. This is the way in which democracy can really operate. Unfortunately, that's not the way we work. Instead, we say, in the US, I'm a Republican, so if the Republicans say this, then this is what I'll do. If I'm a Democrat, so the Democrats say this is what I'll do. So you're polarized and you're not looking at the content of what one is voting on. You just go by whichever side you happen to be on. We have that too. We're not as broken. I think we're less broken. And we should not get there. We should not get there. I mean, it's something to worry. It's something to worry about. There are many other countries, by the way, that we can learn from. For some reason, many of them start with an S. Singapore, Sweden, Switzerland. These are countries that we could really learn from in terms of how they try to engage one with the other and try to build a consensus on different issues.
Right. Naushad, can we go for 10 more minutes? Would that be possible?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
Amazing. So with that, Bhavya, do you want to ask your next question?
Okay, so I actually wanted to talk to you about the role that the Indian diaspora can play in restoring India's potential. Indian Americans are the highest earning ethnic group in the United States. So how can the Indian diaspora, often considered an important part of India's soft diplomacy, help improve the economic and social well-being of India?
I think the Indian diaspora is a huge advantage that we've taken some advantage of, but not full by any means. The best illustration of potential is what's happened with China. If you look at the role that overseas Chinese have played in China's development, the role that Hong Kong played in China's development, there was a period of time when Hong Kong accounted for 50% of all the direct foreign investment into China for about a 5-year period in the 90s to early 2000s. And that wasn't actually Hong Kong. That was actually Taiwanese investment. It couldn't officially go into China, so it went via Hong Kong, right? But this was people investing in China, bringing in new technology, bringing in new practices, new ways of working that ended up actually being the foundation of China's manufacturing miracle. We need the same in India, and we have the potential for the same in India. And we need to be as attractive a place for the Indian diaspora to do business. So for that to happen, we need to be completely open. So I really, I write about this in the last chapter, I think. I really worry about these limits on OCI cards and what OCIs can do and so on. I mean, I thought it was great progress when we started issuing OCI cards. After all, overseas citizens of India, the OCI card was a classic fudge, right? As only we can do it in India. We would have needed a constitutional amendment to permit dual citizenship. And the government of the day did not think it could get that constitutional amendment through. So they came up with this fudge where they said, we'll give people every right except voting through an overseas citizen of India card, and with a very liberal definition of what the basis is of getting that card. You need one great-grandparent who's been Indian. That's it. That was the requirement. Wonderful requirement, wonderfully open. Now, since then, you have some overseas citizens of India who've come into India and have formed, let's say, have set up newspapers and become journalists, and they've written critical articles on the government and so on. And, then you start saying, okay, now we're going to try to control this. So therefore, if you have an OCI card, you cannot indulge in any, and there are now a list of exclusions. And one of the things that it excludes is journalism. So, these are silly, if you ask me. These are us being petty and silly. We're trying to control what we shouldn't be trying to control. We should be saying, as we were earlier on, all overseas citizens of India, anyone with any kind of India connection is most welcome. Come, we're a land of opportunity. We'll be a land of opportunity for decades to come. Come and be part of this. I think that message should be undiluted and powerful. And I think the response will be there. I think the response will be there. I think we've seen already, you see many people who brought up in the US particularly, or in the UK, who, when they've grown up and finished college and so on, have come to India and worked in India for a period of time. Because, even though okay, well, there you go. So, yeah. And that's what we need as a country, right? I mean, you can't ask for anything better. You have people who are choosing to come and be part of the India story. That's the way of making the India story better.
So essentially, are we it's like India shutting out people from coming, not necessarily shutting out, but
no one is claiming, and least of all the government would definitely not claim they're shutting things out. They're trying to control it. They're trying to say, and I think that's the silly thing, because first of all, if we try to control it, we'll control it wrong. We'll keep tripping over our own feet, and which is, by the way, exactly what we've been doing. Yeah. And in the process, you'll end up putting off for every one person who you could say it's good that we kept this person out, you'll end up keeping 100 people off, or turning off 100 people because of the silly restrictions that we now have.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think, you should simply say, hey, listen, yeah, that person was silly, shouldn't have done what they've done, but I'm willing to put up with it because I want the 100 other people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Nidish, want to go next?
Yeah. Okay. So how do you think that aspects from, for example, your time in Stanford, such as the fact that the faculty were barred from proctoring or supervising students taking exams, and also the culture that was present there, where bright students worked very hard but could never show it. How do you think these parts of the college experience impacts students?
Well, it affected students. I'll tell you how it affected students at Stanford. You'd have, the most visible sign of at Stanford would be, students throwing frisbees around on the lawns, right, in the day. And you think, when do they work? And they would work in the night, right? Ask Manu, right? You'd end up going to the library after dinner and then being in the library until it closed at midnight, right? And so you didn't show yourself working, but you showed yourself playing, because that was the way that the culture of the place was. Yeah. So you needed to, you would always, if you went into a test, I think Manu he was at Stanford years and years and years after me, but I bet this didn't change, which is that no one would ever say, I'm really well prepared for this test. Everyone would talk about how they had not had a chance to do any preparation, and were really frightened and worried about how the test would go, right? And it would, this was part of the culture. I'm told it's different to what you would experience at Harvard, for example. And I think it's a different way of being. It's not that one is better than the other. It's just a different way of operating. Yeah. And then by the way, the informality is very striking at Stanford, very striking. Right. Yeah.
So Naushad, we have a,
yeah.
oh yes, Nitish, go ahead, do ask.
Oh yeah, just one thing. How do you think that your personal experience in college developed or led you to form your current opinions on higher education that I mentioned in chapter 7, for example?
Well, a lot. So, Stanford is my reference for, if I'm trying to think of what the right thing to do is for higher education, I do think about Stanford as a reference point, not because everything that Stanford did was right or perfect or whatever, but it was a reference point because I think whatever Stanford did that was wrong, they did many more things that were right. So it's a good reference point. Now, it's not for everyone. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I think Manu would also share this, students very often would come out of Stanford really thinking they were the, they were it. They were the future. Silicon Valley was the future. They were the definition of the world and the direction it should go in. Some of that arrogance was also very prevalent. So that was around as well. So you need to temper that. You need to bring people down to earth every so often. So.
Fantastic. We have a brilliant question from Sonia in the audience. Sonia, do you want to unmute and just ask the question?
So I was reading some of your articles and I was struck by how clear the policy analysis is, which as a person interested in policy, I found shockingly hard to find in the Indian press. Like even with the farm law, most of my friends who know the ins and outs of Roe versus Wade, super educated, Stanford grads, everything, no idea what the basis of the farm law issue actually was. So 2 questions for you. One is, do you have suggestions for where to find strong policy analysis to understand Indian jurisprudence, the analysis behind it, what's going on better? And second, what do you think it will take for the Indian press to evolve in a way to match like that aspect of international press?
So, first of all, in terms of, where would I look? I would look at particular newspapers. So I'll tell you what I subscribe. I subscribe to Business Standard and Indian Express. Yeah. But there are other good newspapers too. The Hindu is very good. Mint is very often good. Those are, if you ask me, the 4 daily newspapers that I think are really worth reading. I don't include the Times of India in that list.
Yeah.
It's very variable. I mean, they have good commentators as well, and good op-ed writers and so on, but not necessarily. Yeah. So I think that the general standard in Indian Express, in Business Standard, Hindu and Mint are good. Now, where would you find elsewhere? The Ken. I think the Ken is a great online newspaper, really, very, and with excellent writing quality. And then individuals, reading, if you read what Pratap Bhanu Mehta writes, sometimes he's a little pompous, but most of the time he's wonderful. And you read what in the Indian Express, they have a page there, which I think it's called the Express Explains or something like that, where they take a different topic and they try to explain what's behind it. And they did this with the farm laws. I think they've done this with Agnipath as well. Those pages tend to be really clear and well done. There's a wonderful book by a data journalist named S. Rukmini. And it's called, I think it's called Whole Truths and Half Facts or something like that.
Yeah, it's published by Westland. Yeah.
It's published by Westland, which is now being shut down, but her book is going to be reprinted. It's a first-rate book. And the great thing about it is it's full of data. And she lets the data tell the story of India, in terms of how Indians live, how they learn, how they fall sick, how they, how they get or don't get justice and so on. And these are, so reading that kind of thing, I think is what I try to do and then, to try and figure out what's the right policy prescription. I try to always think of how do you make this happen? And I always find that that's very helpful because, I often start off being muddled, but as I try to write it out, I will go back and read what I said and say, am I clear? What am I saying here? Am I clear enough in terms of saying what needs to be done and how to do it? Your second part of the question of, how do we build that quality of journalism in the country is a very good one. Unfortunately, we have good journalists in the country, including good young journalists in the country. That's very, I think, hopeful. But it's very variable. You also have a lot of very substandard journalism in the country. And sometimes some of that is systematically undermined. I mean, journalism, it's by the state will advertise in the newspapers that are friendly to it. It's I think we have to be willing to pay for good quality journalism. So I try to support and subscribe to as many different journals and newspapers that, including there's one that I don't agree with at all, which I force myself to subscribe to and read. But it's painful, but it's good to do.
Amazing. We have one final question, Naushad. I know it's 7:10. Final question. Bhavya, do you want to ask the final question, please? That would be question 14 on the list of questions you made. Yeah.
So you list 5 of your favorite books in a footnote in chapter 10. On the nonfiction side, you include Ramachandra Guha's India After Gandhi, David Land's The Wealth and Poverty of Nations, and Albert Hirschman's brilliant Exit, Voice and Loyalty. You also include P.G. Wodehouse's Leave It to Smith, and Alan Bennett's Uncommon Reader. John Stuart Mill's On Liberty is another book you say that narrowly missed being in your top 5 books. As someone who's interested in said books, are there any additional books you would recommend specifically for young people in the audience today?
Well, the Rukmini book, without question. And then Ram Guha has a new book out called Rebels Against the Raj, which is it's quite an obscure topic. It's a book about 7 foreigners, 4 British, 1 Irish, and 2 Americans who came to India between 1890 and 1920 or so. And most of them all of them, I think, except for 1, lived in India for the rest of their lives, and became actually part of the freedom struggle against the British. And it's just a remarkable book. It's Annie Besant is the most famous person there. The other 6, I had vaguely heard them by reading the book, and these stories just come alive. So, and it's the reason why I think it's such an interesting book is because it gives you a sense of how things have changed in the world, and how civilized confrontations seemed to be in the 30s. You had people writing to the viceroy and saying, "I am going to break the law in the following way." And the viceroy writing back, by the way. I mean, this is you have, and then the fellow would get imprisoned, but, so you had this level of exchange that was just very different to what we have now. I mean, it's quite fascinating. And many other books that I would recommend. Rakesh Mohan's book, the book that the Vijay Kelkar, Ajay Shah book, In Service of the Republic, on sort of governance, is a great book, very well written again. I like books that are well written, by the way, that are easy reads, and I think it makes for so much better reading. What else would I recommend offhand? Shyam Saran has a good book out on India's foreign policy. Again, well written. There's a rather nice little book, an old book called The Price of Onions by Ashok Desai, which is a very sort of nice primer on economics with Indian examples. I can give you many more, I'm sure. I can make you a list.
So everything that Naushad has mentioned is on Zoom chat with the Amazon links. So please go ahead and find those.
Great.
Amazing. Excellent. Thank you so much for your time, Naushad. That means the world to me. Any final thoughts, Bhavya, Nidish, anything you want to say? Thanks, anything at all?
No, I just want to thank you for letting us interview you. It's an honor.
No, my pleasure completely. And anything that you want to talk about, Manu has my email, and you can just send me an email. I'm very happy to be in touch. I wanted to say something which I mentioned to Manu. I don't want my book to be read by people like me. I mean, people who are sort of old and think the way I think. I want the book to be read by younger people for sure, because at the end of the day, you're going to make the country. You're going to make the future of the country, and I don't want you to take what I'm saying in the book as the answer, but I really want people, younger people, to engage with these issues and argue about them and get into the kind of discussion that Nidish was talking about in a really good, solid way. Yeah. So I'm delighted to do this. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank you
you.
for your time, Naushad.
Thank you very
Means the
much.
world.
Thank
Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, guys. Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.